The sound was wrong. It was not the familiar drone of cicadas in the oppressive summer heat, nor the rustle of a lizard in the dry leaves. It was a whisper, thin and sharp, slicing through the afternoon stillness of the valley. Malachi reined in his gray gelding, the horse sensing the sudden tension in him, its ears twitching. He had been checking the northern fence line, a monotonous task that should have taken him until dusk, but a broken post had made the work shorter than planned. He was home early. His gaze swept over the gentle slope that led down to his cabin, a dark shape against the parched yellow grass. Everything appeared as he had left it, but the sound had come from the west, from the dense thicket of berry bushes that bordered the creek. His berry bushes. He swung down from the saddle, his movements fluid and silent, the dust barely stirring around his worn boots. He left the horse untethered. It would not wander. His hand rested for a moment on the worn grip of the pistol at his hip, a gesture of instinct rather than intent. He moved toward the thicket, keeping to the low ground, his shadow a fleeting thing among the rocks. The whispering came again, followed by a soft, shushing sound. A child. His jaw tightened. Drifters sometimes followed the creek, but they knew to give his land a wide berth. The solitude of his ranch was a thing he had paid for, not in coin, but in a reputation built on stillness and an unwavering intolerance for trespassers. He parted a cluster of broad leaves, the air within the thicket heavy with the sweet, cloying scent of overripe fruit. And then he saw them. A woman and two small children. They were crouched low, their backs to him, working with a desperate, silent efficiency. The woman's hair was a coil of black silk, her clothes simple and dark. The children, a boy and a slightly smaller girl, moved like sparrows, their tiny hands plucking berries and dropping them into a cloth sack. They were Chinese. A flicker of something, not surprise, but a deep, weary recognition passed through him. He had seen families like them near the railroad camps, their faces etched with a hardship that was both foreign and deeply familiar. He watched for a full minute as the little girl dropped a berry and the boy quickly picked it up, wiping it on his sleeve before placing it in the sack, his movements a perfect pantomime of adult seriousness. The woman murmured something to them in a language he did not understand, her voice a low hum of encouragement and caution. He could have turned back, left them to their pilfering. They would have taken a few pounds of berries and been gone by morning. It would have cost him nothing. But it was the principle of the thing. This was his land. The boundary was absolute. He stepped out from the cover of the bushes. "That's enough," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. The woman froze, her hand hovering over a cluster of dark fruit. She rose slowly, turning to face him, pushing the children behind her skirt with a single protective motion. Her face was thin, her eyes wide and dark with an exhaustion that went beyond the day's heat. She was younger than he first thought. The boy stared at him, his small face a mask of defiance, while the girl buried her face in her mother's leg. The woman's gaze darted from his face to the gun on his hip and back again. She said nothing. He had expected pleading, or perhaps a desperate lie. He received only a profound, waiting silence. He took a step closer, his shadow falling over them. "This is private property." The woman's throat worked, but no sound came out. She clutched the sack of berries to her chest as if it were a shield. He waited, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of his presence settle. Finally she spoke, her voice barely audible, laced with an accent that softened the edges of the words. It was what she said that stopped him, that rooted him to the dusty ground more surely than any anchor. "They said a man named Malachi lived here." The name struck him like a physical blow. It was a key to a door he had locked and sealed a decade ago, a name he himself had not heard spoken aloud in all that time. He was simply the man on the creek, the quiet rancher with no first name and no past. He felt a cold dread uncoil in his gut, a feeling he had almost forgotten. His eyes narrowed, studying her not as a thief, but as a messenger, a harbinger. The fear in her eyes was real, but now he saw something else beneath it, a calculated desperation. She had not stumbled upon his land by accident. She had sought him out. "Who is they?" he asked, his voice a low growl. The question hung in the hot, still air. The woman, Leanne, clutched her children closer. The boy, Bao, peered out from behind her, his small fists clenched. The girl, An, remained hidden, a small, trembling weight against her mother's leg. Leanne's gaze was unwavering, holding his. "Men who took my husband." The simplicity of her answer offered no comfort, only more questions. It was a piece of a story he wanted no part of, a story that had somehow found its way to his doorstep. He should have sent her away. He should have pointed down the creek and told her to walk until she hit the county line. That was the old way, the safe way. But the use of his name had changed the geometry of the situation. It was no longer a simple matter of trespassing. His past, a thing he had outrun across 2 territories, had finally caught up, and it had arrived in the form of a fragile woman and 2 hungry children. He let out a slow breath, the sound of it harsh in the quiet grove. His mind worked methodically, weighing the risks. Allowing them to stay was a danger. Sending them away might be a greater one, for if they knew his name, their pursuers might know it as well. Turning them out would be like releasing a wounded bird in front of a hunting cat. Their fate would be sealed, and the hunters would still know where he lived. He gave a curt nod, not toward her, but toward the open land leading to his cabin. "Come on." He turned without waiting for a reply and walked back to his horse. He did not look back to see if they were following. He knew they would be. The sound of their footsteps in the dry grass behind him was the only confirmation he needed. He swung into the saddle, the leather creaking under his weight, and led the way toward the cabin. The small family trailed behind him like a ragged shadow, the woman carrying the sack of stolen berries, the boy holding fast to her hand, the girl a small, stumbling presence at her side. The cabin looked smaller with them approaching it, its solitude violated. As they reached the packed dirt yard, he dismounted and tied the gelding to the hitching post. He turned and faced them. The sun was beginning to dip toward the western ridge, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the valley floor. "You can stay the night," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "We'll talk in the morning." He did not offer them a welcome. He offered them a temporary stay, a pause in their flight. Leanne simply nodded, her eyes conveying a gratitude so profound it was almost an accusation. She herded her children onto the porch, where they stood uncertainly, their small forms dwarfed by the harsh lines of his home. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was a mistake. He had just invited the world he'd fled back into his life. The door was open now, and he wasn't sure he'd be able to close it again. He spent the first hours of the night on the porch, his rifle resting across his lap, its cool, familiar weight a small comfort. The darkness that fell over the valley was absolute, a thick blanket of black, pricked only by the distant, indifferent light of the stars. Inside the one-room cabin, a single candle flickered, casting a warm, unsteady glow. He had given them what was left of a stew and a loaf of hard bread. He'd watched them eat, the children devouring the food with a silent, desperate hunger that tightened his chest, while the mother, Lynn, ate sparingly, her eyes constantly flitting toward the door, toward the encroaching night. Now they were asleep. He had given them his cot, the only bed in the house. The three of them were a tangle of limbs under his spare blanket, a small island of vulnerable life in the vast, empty space of his home. He had taken a spot on the floor near the hearth, but sleep was a distant country he could not reach. His mind was a turmoil of old ghosts and new fears. Malachi. The name echoed in his thoughts, dredging up memories of a different life, a life of noise and violence and allegiances he had long since renounced. Who were these men who had taken her husband? And what business did they have with him? He rose and moved silently to the edge of the porch, his boots making no sound on the weathered planks. He scanned the dark horizon, the familiar shapes of the ridges and mesas now seeming to hold a hidden menace. He was a man who noticed things. He knew the patterns of the coyotes, the flight of the hawks, the way the wind whispered through the tall grass before a storm. Tonight, he searched for a different kind of sign. The faint glow of a distant campfire, the silhouette of a horseman on a ridge, any ripple in the fabric of his predictable world. There was nothing, only the immense, breathing silence of the land. But the absence of a threat was not the same as the presence of safety. He knew the kind of men who hunted people. They were patient. They were thorough. Leanne and her children had found him, which meant the men pursuing them could find him too. He felt a grim certainty that they were already on their way, drawn to this place like wolves to the scent of blood. He went back inside, the cabin smelling of strange new scents, the faint aroma of the herbs Leanne carried, the simple smell of other people. It was an invasion, a disruption of the sterile order he had cultivated for years. He looked at the sleeping family. The boy, Bao, had an arm flung protectively over his little sister, An, even in sleep. Their mother's face, softened by the candlelight, was a mask of weary resolve. He saw not a burden, but a responsibility that had been thrust upon him. By speaking his name, she had made her problem his. He could not, in good conscience, turn them out to face what was coming alone. It went against the grain of a code he still lived by, a remnant of the man he once was. He stoked the embers in the hearth, the small red glow pushing back the shadows. He settled back onto the floor, his rifle once again across his knees. He would not sleep. He would watch. He would wait. And he would be ready. The quiet life he had built for himself was over. He knew it with a cold, hard finality. The only question now was what would rise from its ashes. The next day began not with conversation, but with a quiet, unspoken negotiation of space. When Malachi rose from the floor at the first hint of dawn, he found Leanne already awake, sitting on the edge of the cot. She had folded his blanket with a neatness that seemed out of place in the rustic cabin. The children were still asleep, their breathing soft and even. She met his gaze, and for a moment the air was thick with questions neither of them was ready to ask. He simply nodded toward the water barrel outside. "There's coffee." He busied himself with the fire, his movements economical and precise. He was aware of her every move behind him. She found the tin mugs, measured out the coffee grounds, and moved with a quiet grace that was at odds with her evident fear. She did not speak, nor did he. The silence was a language of its own, a cautious truce. After they had drunk the bitter coffee, she found his mending kit, a small leather pouch with a few needles and spools of thread. Without a word, she picked up a shirt he had discarded on a peg, its sleeve torn from a snag on a barbed wire fence. She sat on the small stool by the hearth and began to sew, her stitches small and even, a testament to a lifetime of practice. It was a simple act, but it was a claim. She was not a beggar. She was earning her keep. The children woke soon after. Bao, the boy, was solemn, his eyes missing nothing. He watched Malachi with a wary intensity, as if trying to measure the man who held their lives in his hands. The girl, Anne, was shyer, hiding behind her mother and peeking out with curious, dark eyes. Malachi ignored them, going about his morning chores, feeding the horse, checking the water level in the cistern, but he was acutely aware of them, of their small, foreign presence in his world. He learned their names when he heard Leanne murmur them in a soft, reassuring tone. Bao. Anne. The names were unfamiliar, yet they settled in the air of the cabin as if they had always been there. Later that morning, as he was cleaning his rifle on the porch, he saw her check the pouch at her waist. It was a small, oilskin bag, worn and stained with travel, and it was tied securely to her belt. She never took it off. He had noticed it the day before in the berry patch. Now, watching her furtive, protective gesture, he knew with certainty that whatever trouble she was in, its source was contained in that small bag. It was the reason her husband was gone. It was the reason men were hunting her. It was a heavy weight, and she was carrying it directly into the heart of his sanctuary. He finished cleaning the rifle, the scent of gun oil sharp in the dry air. He did not ask her about the pouch. Not yet. To ask the question was to fully accept his role in this unfolding drama, to admit that her fight was now his. For now he would watch. He would wait. He would let this fragile, temporary peace hold for as long as it could. But he could feel the tension building, like the pressure in the air before a lightning strike. The peace was a mirage, and the storm was coming. He looked out at the vast, empty landscape, and for the first time in years it did not feel like a refuge. It felt like a trap. 2 days later, he saw them. He was on the high ridge that overlooked the eastern approach to his valley, a vantage point he used to watch for stray cattle or signs of drought. His eye, trained to spot the slightest anomaly in the landscape, caught the movement first. A flicker of motion that was not the sway of grass or the flight of a bird. He raised his spyglass, the brass warm from the sun, and focused. 3 riders. They were moving at a slow, deliberate pace, not with the urgency of a posse, but with the patient, methodical gait of wolves tracking a scent. They were still miles away, but their presence was a cold knot in his stomach. He watched them for a long time, observing their formation, the way they paused to survey the land, the professional economy of their movements. They were not lawmen. They were not bandits. They were hunters, and he knew their type. Calm, relentless, and utterly without mercy. They wore dusters that covered them from neck to ankle, their faces obscured by the shadows of their hats. There was an unnerving uniformity to them, a sense of shared purpose that was more menacing than any open display of aggression. He lowered the spyglass, a muscle working in his jaw. Leanne had not been exaggerating. The threat was real, and it was drawing closer with every turn of the sun. He made his way back down the ridge, his mind racing. He did not run. His movements remained measured, but a new urgency pulsed beneath the surface. He had to assume they knew where they were going. They might not know his exact location yet, but they were in his valley, and his small ranch was the only sign of life for 50 miles in any direction. When he reached the cabin, the scene was one of deceptive tranquility. Leanne was washing clothes in a wooden tub, the rhythmic sound of her scrubbing a peaceful counterpoint to the silent alarm ringing in his head. Bao and Anne were playing in the dirt near the porch, drawing patterns with a stick. They looked up as he approached, and Anne even gave him a small, hesitant smile. He felt a sharp, unfamiliar pang of protectiveness. They were innocent in this, pawns in a game they couldn't possibly understand. He decided not to tell her, not yet. Panic would not help them. He needed to think, to plan. But his change in demeanor was not lost on Leanne. As he walked past her, she paused her washing, her hands still in the soapy water, and her eyes questioned him. He met her gaze for only a second, but it was enough. He saw the flicker of understanding, the dawning of a shared dread. She knew. She didn't know the specifics, but she knew the waiting was over. He went into the cabin and took down his second rifle, a heavy buffalo gun he hadn't used in years. He checked its action, the metallic click loud in the quiet room. He walked to the back window, which overlooked the creek, and propped the rifle against the wall beside it. He did the same with the shotgun at the front door. He was turning his home into a fortress, and every deliberate action was an admission that a war was coming to his valley. The sun beat down on the small cabin, the heat becoming a suffocating blanket. The world seemed to be holding its breath. The confrontation came that evening. He sat on the porch, watching the shadows lengthen, his senses on high alert. The air was thick with unspoken tension. Inside, Leanne was putting the children to bed on the cot, her voice a low, soothing murmur that did not quite conceal the tremor of fear. Malachi's hand was never far from his pistol. He had considered sending them into the hills to hide, but he knew it was pointless. The hunters would find them. His land, his cabin, was the only defensible ground they had. He had to make his stand here. He saw the rider before he heard him, a lone figure detaching himself from the deepening twilight at the edge of the property. The man rode slowly, his hands in plain sight, a clear signal that this was meant to be a parley, not an attack. Malachi did not move from his chair. He remained perfectly still, a part of the shadows, as the rider approached the yard and dismounted. The man was tall and lean, with a face that seemed composed of hard lines and sharp angles. He moved with a kind of predatory grace, his smile not reaching his cold, observant eyes. "Evenin'," the man said, his voice smooth and pleasant. He stopped a good 20 feet from the porch. "Hope I'm not intrudin'. Name's Flynn. Me and my partners are looking for a lost acquaintance, a railroad surveyor. Wondered if you might have seen him pass through." Malachi's eyes remained fixed on the man. He did not offer his own name. "Haven't seen anyone." Flynn's smile widened slightly, a humorless stretching of the lips. His gaze flickered past Malachi to the cabin door, where a sliver of candlelight was visible. "That's a shame. He was traveling with his wife, a Chinese woman, pretty little thing. Had 2 children with her. It'd be hard to miss a family like that out here." The words were a clear, pointed threat. He knew they were here. This was not a search. It was a notification. Malachi's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "This is private land. Folks who get lost tend to stay lost around here." The air crackled between them. Flynn's amiable facade began to crack, revealing the cold purpose beneath. He took a half step forward, his hand drifting casually toward his belt. "See, the thing is, she's carrying something that doesn't belong to her, something that belongs to our employer. He's a man who likes his property returned." Malachi slowly rose from his chair, his body unfolding with a deliberate, dangerous calm. He was taller than Flynn, his frame broader. His shadow stretched across the yard, enveloping the other man. "Then he should have taken better care of it," Malachi said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "Now, you've had your water. It's time you moved on." Flynn held his gaze for a long moment, his eyes assessing, calculating. He saw the unyielding resolve in Malachi's stance, the quiet certainty that promised violence. He gave a short, sharp nod, the pretense of civility finally gone. "A man can get into a lot of trouble," Flynn said softly, "protecting things that don't belong to him." He turned, swung back into his saddle, and rode away, melting back into the darkness from which he had come. The visit was over. The warning had been delivered. Malachi stood on the porch for a long time, listening until the sound of hoofbeats faded into nothing. The truce was broken. The night would not be quiet. Malachi moved back into the cabin, the oppressive silence within a stark contrast to the storm brewing in his soul. Lynn was standing by the cold hearth, her back ramrod straight. She had heard everything. The children were asleep, oblivious to the mortal danger that now surrounded their small makeshift bed. Her face was pale in the flickering lamplight, her eyes wide with a terror she was fighting to control. "You should not have done that," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This is not your fight." He looked at her, at the fierce, protective maternal instinct warring with her fear. He saw the weight of the pouch at her hip, the MacGuffin that had brought this plague upon them all. He finally had to ask. He had to know what he was dying for. "What is in the bag, Leanne?" His voice was not accusatory, just tired. He had a right to know the name of the ghost that was about to haunt his home. She hesitated, her loyalty to her dead husband fighting against the reality of their situation. She looked at her sleeping children, then back at him. Her decision was made. With trembling fingers, she untied the oilskin pouch from her belt. She didn't hand it to him, but placed it on the small wooden table between them. "My husband, Shin, he was an engineer for the Central Dominion Railroad," she began, her voice low and urgent. "He was a good man, an honest man. He kept the books for the track foreman, a man named Graves." Malachi's eyes narrowed. Graves. He filed the name away. "Graves was stealing," she continued, "skimming money from the payroll, selling company supplies, cheating the Chinese workers out of their wages. Shin found out. He recorded everything, every date, every dollar, every lie. It is all in here." She tapped the pouch. "A ledger, proof of all his crimes." Malachi looked from the pouch to her face. It was a story as old as the hills. Greed, corruption, and a good man paying the price for his integrity. He was going to take it to the marshals in Sacramento, but Graves found out. "He and his men, they came to our shanty in the railroad camp. They killed him. I took the ledger and the children, and I ran." Her story ended, but the unspoken part hung in the air. Graves was not just a foreman. He must have powerful protectors, men who would hire professional hunters like Flynn to retrieve a simple book of numbers. This went deeper than petty theft. "How did you find me?" Malachi asked, the question that had been burning in him since her arrival. "Shin spoke of you once," she said, her eyes distant with memory. "Years ago, before we were married, he worked a silver claim in Nevada. He said there was a man there, a quiet man who kept to himself, but who helped him during a cave-in. A man who was fast with a gun, but never used it unless he had to. He said your name was Malachi, and that you had a sense of justice that was as hard and unyielding as the mountains. When he was killed, I only knew one name to run to." The revelation settled over him, a heavy shroud of fate. A single act of decency from a past he had tried to erase had led this trouble directly to him. He was caught in a web not of his own making, but one woven from the threads of who he used to be. He looked at the ledger on the table, then at the woman and her sleeping children. He had his answer. It didn't matter what was in the bag. It didn't matter that this was not his fight. She had come to him for protection, guided by the ghost of a good deed. He would not fail her. He picked up the ledger and handed it back to her. "Keep it safe," he said. He then pointed to a large flat stone in front of the hearth. "Pry that up. There's a space underneath, a root cellar. You and the children will go down there when it starts." The attack did not come with a rush of hoofbeats or a volley of gunfire. It began with the color red. A flicker of orange light danced against the far wall of the cabin, and the smell of smoke, sharp and acrid, began to snake through the cracks in the door. Malachi cursed under his breath. The barn. They were trying to draw him out, to force him into the open. It was a classic, predictable move. "Now," he said to Leanne, his voice calm and steady. She needed no further prompting. With a strength born of desperation, she helped him pry the heavy flagstone from the floor, revealing a dark, narrow opening. The root cellar was small and smelled of damp earth and old potatoes. She quickly roused the sleeping children, whispering to them in their native tongue, her voice a mixture of urgency and reassurance. Bao's eyes were wide with fear, but he did not cry, his small hand gripping his sister's. Leanne herded them into the darkness below. Before she descended, she turned to Malachi, her face illuminated by the growing glow from outside. "Be safe," she whispered, the words a prayer. He nodded grimly and slid the heavy stone back into place, plunging her and the children into protective blackness. He moved to the back window, the buffalo gun heavy in his hands. He peered through a small gap in the shutters. The barn was fully engulfed now, the flames leaping into the night sky, a roaring beacon in the silent valley. He saw two figures moving near the blaze, their silhouettes stark against the fire. Flynn and another man. They were waiting for him to emerge through the front door, to run toward the fire and save his livestock. His gelding, a creature of habit and calm, was still safely tethered at the hitching post, away from the barn. They had miscalculated. They didn't know him. A third man, Oakes, was circling around toward the back of the cabin, a rifle held at the ready. He was the one Malachi was waiting for. He tracked the man's progress as he used the creek bed for cover. Oakes moved stealthily, but the fire cast unpredictable shadows, betraying his position. Malachi rested the long barrel of the buffalo gun on the windowsill, took a steadying breath, and waited. When Oakes rose from the cover of the rocks to get a better angle on the cabin, Malachi fired. The roar of the gun filled the small room, the recoil slamming into his shoulder. The heavy slug found its mark, and the shadow by the creek crumpled and did not move again. The shot shattered the night's silence. Flynn and the other man, Graves, spun around, realizing their mistake. They had been played. They immediately opened fire on the cabin, bullets thudding into the thick log walls. Malachi dropped to the floor, crawling away from the window. He picked up the shotgun he had placed by the front door. The fight was now on his terms, in his house. He was no longer the hunted. He was the hunter. The next few minutes were a blur of calculated violence. Malachi moved through the familiar darkness of his home with an unnerving precision. He knew every creak in the floorboards, every blind spot, every angle. Splinters of wood exploded inward as bullets tore through the shutters. He ignored them, his focus absolute. He crawled to the front of the cabin, listening. He could hear Flynn shouting instructions to Graves, their voices tight with anger and surprise. They were moving to flank the cabin, one on each side. He waited, his breathing slow and even, the shotgun cool and heavy in his hands. He heard the scrape of a boot on the porch steps. Too loud, a feint. The real threat was the window on the east wall. He moved silently into position beside it, pressing his back against the rough-hewn logs. A rifle barrel poked through the shattered shutter, probing the darkness within. Malachi rose in one fluid motion, brought the shotgun to bear, and fired both barrels. The blast was deafening, a wave of pure destructive force that blew the window frame and the man behind it back out into the night. One of them, likely Graves, was down. Silence descended again, thicker and more menacing than before. He knew Flynn was still out there. Flynn was the smart one, the patient one. He would not make the same mistakes. Malachi reloaded the shotgun, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. He moved to the center of the room, away from all windows and doors, making himself the smallest possible target. He waited. The fire in the barn was beginning to die down, casting the yard in a hellish, flickering glow. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then he heard it. A faint creak from above. The roof. Flynn was on the roof. trying to find a way in through the chimney or a loose patch of sod. Malachi looked up at the stone hearth. A grim smile touched his lips for a fraction of a second. He tossed a small dry log onto the still glowing embers of the hearth. It caught quickly, sending a plume of thick, acrid smoke billowing up the chimney. A choked gasp and a clatter of sliding boots came from above. Flynn tumbled off the roof, landing hard in the dirt yard. Malachi was at the door in an instant, kicking it open. Flynn was on his knees, gasping for air, his pistol still in his hand. He raised it, his movements sluggish. Malachi's own pistol was already leveled. The single shot was a flat, final crack in the night. Flynn fell forward, and then there was only the sound of the crackling embers in the barn and the whisper of the night wind. It was over. He stood there for a long moment, the smoke from his pistol curling in the cool air. The silence that followed the violence was the most profound he had ever known. He was alive. He was alone again. He slowly lowered the gun, the weight of what he had done settling upon him. He walked back inside, the smell of gunpowder and death clinging to him like a shroud. He crossed the room and, with weary effort, slid the heavy flagstone away from the cellar opening. A sliver of pale light from the dying fire cut into the blackness below. He looked down into the darkness, at the 3 pairs of terrified eyes looking back up at him. He helped them out of the cellar, his hands gentle as he lifted Anne into the room, then gave a hand to Bow, and finally to Leanne. They stood in the center of the ravaged cabin, a small, stunned family amidst the debris of the battle. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and spent gunpowder. Bullet holes pockmarked the walls, and shattered glass littered the floor. Leanne's gaze swept over the destruction, then settled on Malachi. She saw the bruises on his face, the exhaustion in his eyes, the grim set of his jaw. She looked at his hands, steady and strong, the same hands that had just dealt death to protect them. There were no words for the gratitude, the horror, the relief that washed over her. Bow, silent throughout the ordeal, finally spoke. He looked up at Malachi, his child's face serious and old. "Are the bad men gone?" Malachi looked down at the boy and nodded slowly. "They're gone." It was a simple truth, but they all knew it was not the whole truth. Flynn and his men were gone, but the man who had sent them, the powerful man whose crimes were detailed in the ledger, was still out there. This place, this small sanctuary Malachi had built, was no longer safe. It had been marked. They could not stay. The knowledge settled upon them all without needing to be spoken. This was not an end, but a new, more dangerous beginning. By dawn, he had made his decision. He worked through the remains of the night, his movements methodical. He buried the 3 men in a shallow grave far from the cabin, a grim task performed under the cold light of the moon. He gathered what few provisions he had, packing them into saddlebags. He took his money from its hiding place, a small tin box buried beneath a loose floorboard. He was stripping his life down to what could be carried on the back of a horse. When Leanne emerged from the cabin as the first gray light of dawn touched the eastern sky, she saw that he had saddled his gelding. He had also bought a gentle pack mule from a neighboring rancher months ago, a purchase he'd made on a whim, and it now stood patiently, loaded with their meager belongings, a few clothes, a water skin, and the small sack of berries they had gathered on that first fateful day. He looked at her, his face an unreadable mask in the pale light. "They'll send more men," he said. It was not a question, it was a statement of fact. "This valley is compromised." He paused, his gaze steady and direct. He was giving her a choice, though his heart already knew the answer he hoped for. "I can take you and the children to the nearest city, leave you there. You can lose yourself in the crowds." He let that option hang in the air for a moment before offering the second. "Or you can come with me. We'll ride north, find a new place, a new name." It was the most he had ever said at one time. It was an offer that was more than just a journey. It was an offer of a shared future, a promise of protection. Leanne looked at her children. Bao was watching Malachi, not with fear, but with a kind of awe. An, holding her mother's hand, seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. Leanne's life in this new country had been one of loss and flight. She had been running from danger. Malachi was offering to run with her, to stand between her family and the shadows that pursued them. Her answer was not in words. She simply walked to the pack mule, lifted Anne into the makeshift seat Malachi had fashioned from a folded blanket, and then helped Bao clamber up behind his sister. She then turned and looked at Malachi, her eyes clear and resolute. He held out a hand to her, and she took it, allowing him to help her up into the saddle behind him. As the sun crested the ridge, they rode out, leaving the cabin and the smoldering ruins of the barn behind them. They did not look back. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger. But as Malachi felt the small, trusting weight of Leanne behind him and heard the quiet chatter of the children on the mule, he knew he was no longer just a man running from his past. He was a man riding toward a future, a guardian to a family he had never expected, on a journey that had just begun.